Hi guys! Today we've got one of the strangest stories, why a princess married a corpse, and how it was actually legal. If you enjoy eerie but fascinating stories like this, give a like, subscribe, and stay with us. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. Always fun to see who's joining from around the world. Now dim the lights, get comfy. Let the hum of the fan be the only sound. Let's begin this nighttime journey. Union with silence. The Memoirs of Princess Isabella de Bourbon-Condé, Versailles, 1724. Today marks my 53rd year upon this earth. Half my life I have spent in union with one who could not answer my words. Only now, when wrinkles have carved my face deeper than furrows in a field, am I ready to tell of that marriage, which shook the entire court and changed the fate of our kingdom. It was in the year of our Lord 1674, at the court of Louis XIV, when I, a 17-year-old girl, became the bride of a prince whose journey had ended 3 days before our wedding. Chapter 1. The Golden Cage, the scent of lavender and powder, the rustle of taffeta across marble floors, the chime of crystal pendants on chandeliers when draughts wandered through the endless halls of Versailles. These are the memories that rise first when I close my eyes and travel back to those days when I was still foolish enough to believe that love and politics could walk hand in hand. I was born Isabella Marie de Bourbon-Condé in the winter of 1657, when snow lay thick upon the gardens of Chantilly, and my father's debts lay even thicker upon his conscience. The House of Condé had fallen from the king's favour after my grandfather's unfortunate alliance with the Fronde rebels, and though we maintained our titles and our chateau, the gold had long since flowed away like water through cupped hands. My mother, God rest her soul, died bringing me into this world. Perhaps she knew what fate awaited her daughter and chose to depart before witnessing it. My father, Louis de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, raised me with the stern devotion of a man who understood that daughters were currency in the great game of European politics. From my earliest memory, I knew I would marry not for affection, but for alliance. This was the way of our world, as fixed as the rising sun or the changing seasons. Love was a luxury for shopkeepers and farmers, not for those who bore the weight of bloodlines stretching back to Charlemagne. The Chateau of Chantilly was my prison and my paradise. Built by my great-grandfather, it rose from an island in an artificial lake like something from a fairy tale. The walls were painted with scenes of classical mythology, Diana hunting with her hounds, Apollo driving his chariot across painted skies. I spent countless hours studying those frescoes, imagining myself as one of those goddesses, powerful and free. But reality intruded with each lesson from my tutors. Monsieur de Beauvais taught me Latin and mathematics, skills deemed necessary for a princess who might one day need to read treaties and calculate dowries. Madame de Montespan, not the king's famous mistress, but her distant cousin, instructed me in deportment, dancing, and the intricate art of court conversation. "Remember, child," she would say, tapping her ivory fan against my shoulder when my posture slumped. "A princess is always performing. Even in private, you must carry yourself as if the king himself were watching." How prophetic those words would prove. The court at Versailles was a universe unto itself, spinning around the radiant sun of Louis XIV. When I was 15, my father judged me ready for presentation. I remember that first journey from Chantilly to Versailles as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The carriage wheels grinding against cobblestones, the gradual increase in traffic as we approached the palace, the way my stomach clenched with each mile. Versailles was not yet the glittering monument it would become. Construction scaffolding still surrounded portions of the facade, and the gardens were young, their hedges low, and their fountains newly installed. But even in its incomplete state, the palace possessed a grandeur that took my breath away. The Galerie des Glaces had just been completed, and I will never forget walking through it for the first time. 17 arched windows faced 17 arched mirrors, creating an infinity of reflections that made me dizzy. Sunlight streamed through the windows and multiplied in the mirrors, filling the gallery with a golden radiance that seemed almost divine. "Beautiful, is it not?" a voice said behind me. I turned to see a young man, perhaps 3 years older than myself, dressed in cloth of gold with diamond buttons that caught the light. His hair was dark and powdered white in the fashion of the court, his eyes the colour of winter sky. This was my first glimpse of Prince Philippe Auguste de Bourbon-Orléans, second son of the king's brother, grandson of Louis XIII, and my future husband. Though I did not know it then, I was looking upon the man I would marry 3 days after his path had ended. Philippe Auguste possessed the easy confidence of one born to privilege. He moved through the court like a dancer, always in perfect step with the complex choreography of royal etiquette. When he spoke, others listened. When he laughed, others smiled. He had that rare gift of making each person feel as though they were the most important individual in the room. "Mademoiselle de Bourbon-Condé," he said, offering me his arm. "Would you do me the honour of viewing the king's new fountain?" We walked together through the gardens, past parterres laid out in intricate geometric patterns, past groves where courtiers played at being shepherds and shepherdesses. The fountain he wished to show me was the newly completed Bassin d'Apollon, where a golden Apollo emerged from the waters, driving his 4 horses toward the sky. "Do you see how the sculptor captured the moment of transformation?" Philippe Auguste asked. "Apollo is no longer the god of night, but not yet fully the god of day. He exists in that liminal space between one state and another." I found his observation remarkably prescient, though I could not have known why at the time. Our courtship, if it could be called that, lasted 18 months. We met at balls and hunting parties, at chapel services and theatrical performances, always under the watchful eyes of chaperones, always following the prescribed rituals of aristocratic romance. Philippe Auguste was kind to me, and I believe I was not indifferent to him. He possessed wit and learning, and he treated me with the respectful affection appropriate to our stations. We discussed poetry and philosophy, compared our thoughts on the sermons we heard, and found ourselves in pleasant agreement on most subjects. Was it love? I was young enough then to think it might be. When he took my hand during the court dances, I felt my pulse quicken. When he complimented my appearance or my conversation, warmth spread through my chest like wine. When our marriage contract was signed in the presence of the king himself, I allowed myself to dream of happiness. The wedding was planned for the feast of St. John the Baptist, June 24th, 1674. It would be a grand affair, worthy of two great houses joining in alliance. The ceremony would take place in the chapel of Versailles, with the king himself presiding. Cardinals and duchesses, foreign ambassadors, and princes of the blood would witness our vows. My wedding gown was a marvel of the couturier's art. Made of ivory silk so fine it seemed to glow from within, it was embroidered with silver thread in patterns of roses and fleur-de-lis. The bodice was stiff with whalebone, the skirt so wide I could barely pass through doorways. The train stretched 12 feet behind me, requiring 2 pages to carry it properly. But the crown jewel of my ensemble, literally, was the diamond tiara that had belonged to Anne of Austria, mother of the king. It was a delicate thing, wrought in the shape of a garden, with diamond flowers and emerald leaves that caught every flicker of candlelight. 3 days before the wedding, I was in my chambers at Versailles, submitting to the ministrations of my ladies-in-waiting. They were fitting me for the final time, pinning and tucking, ensuring that every fold lay perfectly. The room buzzed with happy chatter about the ceremony to come, the feast that would follow, the dancing that would continue until dawn. Then came the knock that changed everything. It was not the polite tap of a servant or the confident rap of a courtier. This was urgent, almost frantic. My lady-in-waiting, Madame de Maintenon, the future queen, though none knew it then, went to the door. The messenger was one of the king's pages, a boy no older than 12, his face pale as parchment. He whispered something to Madame de Maintenon, who stepped back as if struck. "Leave us," she commanded the other ladies. When we were alone, she turned to me with eyes that held a strange mixture of pity and calculation. "There has been an incident," she said carefully. "Prince Philippe Auguste. His journey has ended." The words made no immediate sense. Journey? What journey? He was here at Versailles, preparing for our wedding, just as I was. "I don't understand," I said. She crossed to the window and gazed out at the gardens where Philippe Auguste and I had walked so many times. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler. "There was a hunting accident yesterday morning. The prince's horse threw him. His head struck a stone. The physicians could do nothing." The room seemed to tilt around me. I felt as though I were falling, though I remained seated on my dressing stool. The weight of the diamond tiara suddenly seemed unbearable. He has... Yes, child. 3 days before, he was to become your husband. I should have wept. I should have torn my gown and cast myself upon the floor in grief. But instead, I felt only a strange numbness, as if part of my soul had detached itself and floated away. "What happens now?" I heard myself ask. Madame de Maintenon's reply would echo in my memory for the rest of my days. "Now, we determine what is best for France." Chapter 2: The Council of Necessity. In the hours that followed, Versailles transformed from a palace preparing for celebration into something resembling a battlefield headquarters. Messengers arrived and departed with military precision. Doors that were usually open closed firmly. Conversations that had flowed like water now moved in careful, measured drops. I was not permitted to leave my chambers. Food appeared at regular intervals, brought by servants who would not meet my eyes. From my window, I could see the comings and goings in the courtyard below, but the thick glass muffled all sound. It was like watching a pantomime performed by ghosts. On the second day of my confinement, my father arrived. Louis de Bourbon, Prince de Condé, entered my chamber with the bearing of a general surveying a fortress he must either defend or abandon. His face bore the marks of a sleepless night, and his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of hasty travel. "Isabella," he said, taking my hands in his, "I am sorry for your loss." Even then, I noticed he did not say our loss or France's loss. It was my loss, personal and specific. "What is to become of me, Papa?" I asked. The question sounded childish to my own ears, but I truly did not know. He released my hands and moved to the fireplace, staring into flames that provided no warmth despite the June heat. "That depends on many factors, most of which are beyond our control. The alliance between our houses will proceed as planned." I stared at him. "But how can that be? Philippe Auguste is gone." My father turned from the fire, and I saw in his eyes a hardness I had never noticed before. "There are precedents, Isabella. Ancient precedents, sanctioned by both church and crown when circumstances demand extraordinary measures." A chill ran through me despite the summer air. "What precedents?" Before he could answer, another knock came at the door. This time it was not urgent but formal, the measured rap of official business. Madame de Maintenon entered, followed by a figure I recognized but had never spoken to directly. Cardinal Bossuet, the king's confessor and one of the most powerful men in France. Jacques Benigne Bossuet was then 57 years old, a man whose learning was matched only by his ambition. His face bore the mark of one who had spent decades studying both divine and earthly power, and had found ways to serve both masters without contradiction. "Your Royal Highness," he said to my father, offering a bow precisely calculated to acknowledge rank while asserting his own authority. "Mademoiselle de Bourbon-Condé." A shallower bow for me, but his eyes remained fixed on my face as if examining my soul for cracks. "Cardinal," my father replied, "I trust you bring word from His Majesty." "I do indeed. But first, let me offer the Church's condolences on this tragic loss. Prince Philippe Auguste was a young man of great promise, taken from us in the flower of his youth." "God's will is mysterious," Madame de Maintenon murmured, though her tone suggested she found nothing mysterious about political necessity. Cardinal Bossuet nodded gravely. "Indeed. And it is precisely because God's will moves in ways beyond our understanding that the Church has, throughout history, provided guidance for situations that might seem unusual to those of limited theological training." I felt like a piece on a chessboard, valuable but powerless, waiting to learn where the players intended to move me. "The king," the cardinal continued, "has consulted with both civil and canon lawyers regarding the matter of the alliance between the houses of Bourbon-Orléans and Bourbon-Condé. The political implications of dissolving this union extend far beyond France. Treaties with Austria depend upon it. The balance of power in Europe requires it." "Speak plainly, Your Eminence," my father said. "What does the king propose?" Bossuet clasped his hands behind his back, the gesture of a professor about to deliver a lecture. "There exists, in both Roman law and church doctrine, provision for what is termed matrimonium post-mortem, marriage after the completion of one party's earthly journey. Such unions have been recognized when the betrothal was complete, the contract signed, and the political necessity absolute." The room fell silent except for the crackling of logs in the fireplace. I felt as though I were listening to words spoken in a foreign language, though I understood each one perfectly. You speak of marriage to one who cannot, I began. Who cannot speak his vows, yes, Bossuet acknowledged, but whose consent was given in life, whose signature graces the marriage contract, whose political body remains part of the alliance, even though his natural body has found its rest. Madame de Maintenon stepped forward. The ceremony would be conducted with all proper dignity. The church would sanctify it. The king would witness it. In the eyes of God and France, you would be as truly married as if the prince stood beside you speaking his responses. But he would not be standing beside me, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. No, my father said quietly, he would not. I rose from my chair and walked to the window. Below in the gardens, courtiers strolled along the geometric paths, their lives continuing in their prescribed patterns despite the upheaval in mine. A thought occurred to me, sharp and bitter as winter wind. And after this ceremony, what then? Do I remain wed to silence for the rest of my days? The alliance would be sealed, Cardinal Bossuet replied. The political necessity would be satisfied. As for the rest... He spread his hands in a gesture that encompassed infinite possibility and none at all. My father joined me at the window. Isabella, I will not lie to you. This is not the future we planned, but consider the alternatives. Without this alliance, our house falls further from a royal favor. Our debts will crush us. You will have no husband, no protection, no future worthy of your birth. And with it, you become one of the most important women in France. The king's gratitude will be yours. Your children, when you have them, will be secured in their inheritance. The House of Condé will rise again. My children? I turned to stare at him. How can there be children from such a union? Another silence. Then Madame de Maintenon spoke, her voice carefully neutral. The king is still a young man, and a grateful monarch has many ways to ensure the continuation of important bloodlines. The implication struck me like a physical blow. I was to be married to one who could not consummate the union, then bedded by another to produce heirs who would legitimize the entire arrangement. The cynicism was breathtaking in its scope. This is what you propose, I asked. This is what the church sanctions, what the king commands. The king requests, Cardinal Bossuet corrected. You retain the right to refuse, but consider well the consequences of that refusal. I did consider them. I was 17 years old, possessed of no fortune beyond my bloodline, no prospects beyond marriage, no power beyond what others chose to grant me. If I refused this grotesque arrangement, I would return to Chantilly to live out my days as a burden on my father's diminished estate. I would never marry. What prince would want a bride who had rejected the king's direct request? I would bear no children, establish no household, wield no influence in the affairs of the realm. Yet if I agreed... How long do I have to decide? I asked. The ceremony is planned for tomorrow evening, my father said. The guests have been informed that it will proceed as scheduled, though the nature of the ritual has been adjusted. 24 hours to choose between shame and a different kind of shame, between poverty and power, between obscurity and a place in history that would be remembered long after I was dust. I need time to pray, I said. Of course, Cardinal Bossuet replied. I will send Father Massillon to hear your confession and provide spiritual counsel. After they left, I knelt before the crucifix in my chamber and tried to find God's voice among the clamoring demands of earthly necessity. but the only sound was the ticking of the ornate clock on my mantelpiece, marking the passage of hours that brought me closer to a decision I was not prepared to make. That night, I dreamed I stood in a great cathedral filled with candles. At the altar waited a figure in wedding clothes, but when I approached, I saw it was carved from marble, beautiful and cold and eternal. When I reached out to touch its face, my hand passed through it like mist. I woke knowing what I would do. Chapter 3. The Ceremony of Shadows. The Chapel of Versailles had never hosted such a wedding. Word had spread despite all attempts at discretion, and the air hummed with whispered conversations and barely contained curiosity. Foreign ambassadors sat beside French nobles, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of diplomatic neutrality. The ladies of the court wore their finest gowns, as if beauty could somehow normalize the unprecedented nature of what they were about to witness. I entered the chapel wearing the same ivory silk gown that had been fitted for my original wedding. The diamond tiara of Anne of Austria caught the light from hundreds of candles, creating small rainbows that danced across the stone walls. My train swept behind me like a river of moonlight, carried by the same two pages who had rehearsed this duty for a different ceremony. But there was no bridegroom waiting at the altar. Instead, there was a catafalque draped in cloth of gold, topped with the regalia of the House of Bourbon-Orléans. Philippe Auguste's sword lay across the silk, its hilt gleaming with gems. His coronet rested at the head of the bier, as if he had just removed it for sleep. Candles burned at each corner, their flames steady in the still air. I had not seen his earthly form since the accident. My father had decided it would be too distressing, and perhaps he was right. It was easier to imagine Philippe Auguste as merely absent than to confront the reality of his departure. The catafalque allowed for that fiction. He was there and not there, present in symbol if not in flesh. Cardinal Bossuet stood behind the altar in his finest vestments, a cope of gold brocade that seemed to glow in the candlelight. His face was solemn but determined, the expression of a man performing a necessary duty regardless of personal qualms. King Louis XIV occupied the front pew, resplendent in cloth of silver with diamonds at his throat and wrists. At 36, he was at the height of his power and beauty, the Sun King around whom all of Europe revolved. His presence transformed this strange ceremony from scandal into sacrament, from aberration into policy. Beside him sat his brother Philippe, Duke of Orléans, father of my absent bridegroom. His face was a mask of grief and dignity, but I caught the moment when his eyes met mine. In them I saw not blame, but a kind of terrible understanding. We were both caught in the machinery of royal necessity, both sacrificing personal feeling for dynastic duty. The ceremony began with the traditional call, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the face of this congregation to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." But there was no man to join with me, only the memory of one draped in golden silk. I spoke my vows to empty air, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed chapel. I, Isabella Marie de Bourbon-Condé, take thee, Philippe Auguste de Bourbon-Orléans, to be my wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. The irony of that final phrase was not lost on anyone present. Death had already done its work. and yet here I stood, binding myself to its handiwork. When the moment came for Philippe Auguste's response, Cardinal Bossuet spoke for him, reading from the marriage contract signed months earlier. I, Philippe Auguste de Bourbon-Orléans, take thee, Isabella Marie de Bourbon-Condé, to be my wedded wife. The words echoed strangely in the stone chapel, as if the building itself were protesting this violation of natural order. But the king nodded his approval, and what the king approved, God surely blessed. The exchange of rings proceeded with dreamlike precision. I placed a golden band on the third finger of Philippe Auguste's sword hand, the metal cold against my skin. Cardinal Bossuet then took a matching ring from the altar and slipped it onto my finger, pronouncing us husband and wife in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. The congregation exhaled collectively, a sound like wind through autumn leaves. It was done. I was married to silence, wed to memory, bound to a political necessity that wore the mask of romance. But the strangest moment was yet to come. As the wedding party processed from the chapel, I walked alone beside the catafalque, carried by 6 nobles of the blood. To observers, it must have looked like a funeral cortege interrupted by a bride, or perhaps a wedding procession haunted by death. The two ceremonies had merged into something entirely new. A ritual that belonged neither to celebration nor mourning, but to the peculiar demands of statecraft. The wedding feast was held in the Hall of Mirrors, that gallery of infinite reflections where I had first met Philippe Auguste. Tables groaned under the weight of gilded plates and crystal goblets, roasted peacocks and sugar sculptures depicting scenes from classical mythology. Musicians played in the gallery above, their melodies drifting down like blessings or curses. I sat at the high table in the place of honor, but the chair beside me remained empty. A goblet of wine was placed there, untouched throughout the evening. A plate of food was set before it, growing cold as the hours passed. The servants maintained the fiction with the same precision they brought to all their duties, as if serving invisible nobility was simply another skill required at court. The king rose to offer a toast, his voice carrying easily through the vast hall. To the Princess of Orléans, whose virtue and devotion honor both the memory of her husband and the alliance between our houses. May God bless this union and all that flows from it. Princess of Orléans. The title was mine now, bought with the currency of the impossible. I lifted my goblet and drank, the wine bitter on my tongue. Throughout the evening, courtiers approached to offer congratulations, their words carefully chosen to acknowledge the peculiar nature of my situation without dwelling on its strangeness. What a testament to true love, one duchess murmured. How romantic to bind yourself eternally to his memory, whispered another. Each comment felt like a small blade, precise and painless until the accumulated cuts began to bleed. The dancing began near midnight. I was expected to participate, of course, but how does one dance at one's own wedding without a partner? The solution, devised by the masters of ceremony, with the same ingenuity they brought to all problems of protocol, was for me to dance with the king himself. Louis XIV was renowned as the finest dancer in Europe, and he moved with the grace of one for whom music was a second language. As we turned and stepped through the intricate patterns of the court dance, he spoke quietly. His words meant for my ears alone. "You have done France a great service today," he said. "This alliance secures our eastern borders, and prevents a war that would have cost thousands of lives. I am glad to have been of use, Your Majesty. You will be well cared for, I promise you that. The Orléans household is wealthy, your position secure, and in time—" He paused, allowing the implication to linger unspoken. "In time. Grief does not last forever, Isabella, and France needs heirs from this union." There it was, stated with the casual authority of absolute monarchy. I was wed to a memory, but expected to produce children for the future. The contradiction was dizzying, yet somehow I was meant to navigate it, with grace and dignity. The dance ended, and I curtsied deeply to my sovereign. Around us, the court applauded, the sound echoing through the hall of mirrors, until it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As the evening wound toward dawn, I found myself increasingly desperate for solitude. The weight of performed normalcy had become unbearable. I longed to tear off the diamond tiara, to flee from the endless reflections and whispered observations, to find some place where I could simply exist without being watched and judged and calculated. But there was no escape. As the bride, I was the center around which the entire celebration revolved. Every eye followed my movements, every gesture was noted and interpreted. I was no longer Isabella, a girl of 17 with hopes and fears and private thoughts. I was Princess of Orléans, a creation of political necessity, a symbol that must never crack or show weakness. Near dawn, when the last guests had finally departed and the servants began cleaning up the debris of celebration, I was escorted to my new chambers in the wing reserved for the Orléans family. These rooms had been prepared for a different kind of wedding night, with rose petals scattered on silk sheets and silver bowls of fruit and wine arranged on delicate tables. But there would be no bridegroom to share these preparations. I dismissed my ladies-in-waiting and stood alone in the center of the marriage chamber, still wearing my wedding gown, still crowned with diamonds that caught the first light of morning streaming through tall windows. In the looking glass across the room, I saw my reflection, a young woman in ivory silk, beautiful and alone, and bound by promises to empty air. Behind me, the great bed waited with its coverlets turned down invitingly, as if at any moment a husband might appear to claim his bride. I had married silence, but silence, I discovered, could be the loudest thing of all. Chapter 4: The Weight of Crown and Conscience. The months following my wedding passed in a strange suspension of time, as if all of Versailles had agreed to pretend that my situation was perfectly normal, while simultaneously being fascinated by its abnormality. I learned to navigate this contradiction with the skill of a diplomat, acknowledging my widowhood without dwelling on its peculiar timing, accepting condolences for a loss that had preceded my gain. My daily routine established itself with the precision of court ritual. I woke each morning in the Orléans apartments, in chambers designed for a couple, but occupied by one. A place was still set at my breakfast table for Philippe Auguste, though the chair remained empty. His personal effects, books, letters, a miniature portrait of his spaniel, remained exactly as he had left them, creating a museum of interrupted life. The court treated me with a careful mixture of deference and pity. I was, after all, both a princess and a widow, deserving of respect for my rank and sympathy for my loss. But there was something else in their glances, a curiosity about how one lived as the wife of memory, the bride of absence. My father visited regularly, ostensibly to check on my welfare, but actually to monitor the political implications of my situation. The alliance he had secured through my marriage was proving its worth. Austria had honored the trade agreements that depended on the Bourbon-Orléans Union. The eastern borders remained peaceful. My sacrifice was yielding dividends in gold and stability. "You look well," he said during one such visit, studying my face as if searching for cracks in a valuable vase. "Court life agrees with you." "As much as it can," I replied. We were walking in the gardens, following paths where Philippe Auguste and I had once strolled as betrothed lovers. Now I walked them as his widow, though I had never truly been his wife. "There has been talk," my father continued carefully, "about your future." "What sort of talk?" "The king is concerned about the succession. The Orléans line cannot end with Philippe Auguste." I stopped walking. We were beside the Basin of Apollo, where the golden god drove his horses eternally toward a dawn that never fully arrived. "What does the king propose?" "Nothing improper, of course, but there are ways, arrangements that could be made to ensure that your marriage bears fruit despite its unique circumstances." The euphemisms were delicate, but the meaning was clear. Someone else would father children who would be legally Philippe Auguste's heirs. The fiction of my marriage would be maintained while the reality was managed by others. "Who?" I asked. My father's pause told me everything. "His Majesty has not yet decided, but when he does, it will be someone of appropriate rank and discretion. The king himself, in other words. Louis XIV would father children on his brother's daughter-in-law, creating heirs for a house that had died with its prince. The arrangement would be sanctified by necessity and cloaked in discretion, but it would be royal adultery nonetheless. And if I refuse, Isabella..." My father's voice carried a warning. "You are not in a position to refuse the king's desires. Your marriage has made you valuable to France, but only as long as you remain useful." That night, alone in my chambers, I considered the strange turns my life had taken. I had been raised to be a dutiful daughter, then a loyal wife, and now I was expected to become a discreet mistress to my sovereign, while maintaining the fiction of devotion to my departed husband. Each role required me to sacrifice a piece of my authentic self on the altar of political convenience. Yet what choice did I have? To rebel would mean disgrace, not just for myself, but for my family. The House of Condé would fall. Our estates would be confiscated. Our name would become synonymous with treason. One woman's conscience seemed a small price to pay for so much stability. The summons came 3 weeks later, delivered by Madame de Maintenon with her usual mixture of sympathy and steel. "His Majesty requests your presence in his private study tomorrow evening. He wishes to discuss matters of mutual interest." I knew what those matters would be, and I also knew that there was only one acceptable response to a royal request. Of course, I am honored by His Majesty's attention. The king's private study was smaller and more intimate than his public chambers, furnished with comfort rather than grandeur. Books lined the walls, works of history and philosophy, theology and statecraft. A fire burned in the grate despite the autumn warmth, casting dancing shadows across Persian carpets and gilded furniture. Louis XIV was approaching 40 then, still handsome, but marked by the weight of absolute power. His face had acquired lines that spoke of decisions no other man could make, responsibilities that could not be shared or delegated. When he looked at me, I saw both the man and the monarch, desire complicated by duty. "Isabella," he said, rising from behind his desk, "thank you for coming. The pleasure is mine, Your Majesty." He gestured to a chair placed carefully across from his own, close enough for intimate conversation, but far enough to maintain propriety. Between us sat a small table with wine and delicate pastries, the trappings of seduction rendered respectable by royal protocol. "I have been thinking about your situation," he began, pouring wine into 2 crystal goblets. "It is unique in our experience. I am aware of that, Your Majesty. You have shown remarkable dignity in navigating these unusual circumstances. France is grateful for your sacrifice. I have done only what duty required. And now duty requires something more." He handed me a goblet, his fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch was not accidental. "The alliance your marriage secured must be made permanent through children. The Orléans line cannot be allowed to die. I understand, Your Majesty, but given the nature of my union..." "Yes, that presents certain practical difficulties." His smile was both charming and calculating. "Difficulties that require creative solutions." He rose and moved to the window, gazing out at gardens lit by the first stars of evening. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of royal command disguised as personal appeal. "I have decided to take a personal interest in ensuring the continuation of the Orléans succession. Your children will be legitimate heirs to that house, though their true parentage will remain a matter of state confidence. And their father will be someone worthy of their blood and capable of their protection." He turned back to me, and I saw in his eyes the look of a man accustomed to having his desires fulfilled without question. Someone who already cares deeply for their mother's welfare. The proposition was laid out with the same precision used for military campaigns or trade negotiations. I would become the king's mistress, but discreetly, maintaining the fiction of my marriage to Philippe Auguste, while producing children who would inherit as his legitimate heirs. The arrangement would satisfy political necessity while providing the king with a new diversion from the burdens of absolute rule. "What if I conceive no children?" I asked. "Then we will continue trying until you do." His confidence was absolute, rooted in the divine right that made his will indistinguishable from God's own design. I set down my wine untouched. The crystal caught the firelight, throwing tiny rainbows across the mahogany table. "And what of my reputation?" "My honor." "Your honor lies in service to France. As for reputation... He shrugged with the casual dismissal of one who had never needed to worry about gossip. "The court will see what we choose to show them. A grieving widow who finds comfort in her sovereign's paternal care. A princess whose devotion to her departed husband inspires the king's protection." The euphemisms were prettier than my father's, but the meaning remained the same. I would be a royal mistress masquerading as a mourning bride, producing bastards who would be legitimized by legal fiction and political necessity. "When would this arrangement begin?" I heard myself ask, as if I were negotiating the terms of a business contract, rather than the sale of my body and soul. "Soon. The court physician has calculated your most fertile period. We would not want to delay unnecessarily. Even my monthly cycles had become matters of state interest. I felt like a broodmare being prepared for stud, valuable only for my ability to produce the next generation of pawns in the game of European politics. I need time to consider. Isabella. The king's voice carried a note of warning, gentle but unmistakable. This is not a request. It is a royal command, softened by my personal affection for you, but nonetheless binding. You will submit to this arrangement, or you will face the consequences of disobedience. Those consequences, unspoken but clearly implied, would extend far beyond personal disgrace. My father's estates, my family's future, the delicate web of alliances that kept France stable, all of it depended on my compliance. I rose from my chair with as much dignity as I could summon. Then I am, as always, Your Majesty's obedient servant. His smile returned, warm and satisfied. I knew you would understand. You are wiser than your years suggest. The irony was bitter. Wisdom, in this context, meant recognizing the futility of resistance, accepting that my body belonged not to me, but to the state that had shaped my birth and would determine my death. Chapter 5. The Dance of Deception. 3 days later, I received word that His Majesty wished to show me the new pavilion being constructed in the gardens. Such invitations were common enough. The king took pride in his architectural projects and often shared them with favoured courtiers. No one would think it strange that the grieving Princess of Orléans should be honoured with a private tour. The pavilion sat in a grove of young oak trees, far enough from the main palace to ensure privacy, but close enough to maintain the fiction of propriety. It was a small building in the classical style, its white marble columns gleaming in the afternoon sun. Inside, I discovered rooms furnished with an intimacy that spoke of purposes beyond architectural appreciation. Beautiful, is it not? The king said, standing close enough that I could smell the bergamot in his hair powder. I had it designed as a place of contemplation, somewhere to escape the pressures of court life. It is lovely, Your Majesty. I thought you might find it peaceful, a place where you could come to remember your husband without the constant scrutiny of court eyes. The fiction was established with practiced ease. This would be my retreat for mourning, my sanctuary for grief. That it would also serve as the setting for our assignations was a detail that would never be spoken aloud, but was understood by all who needed to know. He showed me through the rooms. A small salon with silk-covered walls, a library stocked with devotional works, and in the back, a bedchamber furnished with surprising luxury for a place of supposed solitude. The bed was hung with blue silk, the colour of heaven and purity, as if blessing what would occur there. You may come here whenever you wish, he said, producing a golden key from his waistcoat. Consider it your private domain. The key was warm from his body when he placed it in my palm. Such a small thing, yet it represented the seal on our arrangement. I was now the keeper of a secret pavilion, a widow with a hidden life, a princess bound by invisible chains of gold and silk. Our first encounter took place a week later, on a Tuesday afternoon when the court was occupied with a hunting party I had begged leave to miss, citing a headache brought on by memories of Philippe Auguste's fatal accident. The excuse was accepted with the mixture of sympathy and satisfaction that greeted all evidence of my proper widowly devotion. I walked to the pavilion alone, my steps measured and deliberate on the gravel paths. Servants I passed bowed respectfully, seeing only a grieving princess seeking solitude for her prayers. None suspected that I was walking toward my transformation from wife to mistress, from princess to concubine. The king was waiting in the salon, dressed not in his formal court attire, but in a simple coat of dark blue wool that made him look younger, more approachable. He had dismissed his usual retinue, creating the illusion that we were simply a man and woman meeting for conversation, rather than monarch and subject enacting a political necessity. "Isabella," he said, rising as I entered, "you came. Did your Majesty think I would not? I hoped you would recognize the wisdom of our arrangement, but I know it requires adjustments to your expectations of married life." He poured wine from a bottle I recognized as coming from his private cellars, reserved for the most important occasions. Everything about our encounter was designed to suggest honor rather than coercion, pleasure rather than duty. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass. "To service to France," I replied, the words tasting like ashes. We drank, and then he took my hand and led me toward the bedchamber. I moved like a woman in a dream, observing my own actions from some distant place in my mind. This was happening to someone else, some other princess, some other widow, who had agreed to bear royal bastards in exchange for political stability. What followed was neither violent nor gentle, neither passionate nor cold. It was a royal coupling, performed with the efficiency of state business and the courtesy due to rank. The king was not unkind, but neither was he a lover. He was a man fulfilling his duty to the realm, using my body as an instrument of policy. Afterward, as we lay in the blue silk bed while afternoon light filtered through curtained windows, he spoke of practical matters. When I should return, how we would schedule our meetings, what signs to watch for that might indicate success in our endeavor. "The court physician will monitor your condition discreetly," he said. "When you quicken with child, we will adjust our meetings accordingly. And if the child is born obviously yours, if it bears your features rather than Philippe Auguste's." Royal blood has a way of asserting itself regardless of official parentage. No one will question a child who resembles its grandfather or great-uncle rather than its supposed father. The logistics of deception had been planned with the same attention to detail that marked all royal enterprises. Every contingency had been considered, every potential scandal anticipated and prepared for. I returned to my chambers as the sun was setting, my ladies-in-waiting commenting on how refreshed I looked after my afternoon of private prayer. The irony was that I did feel different, though not refreshed. I felt as though I had crossed some invisible threshold, left behind the last vestiges of the girl I had been, and fully embraced the role of woman I was required to become. That night, I knelt before the crucifix in my private chapel and tried to pray for forgiveness. But the words would not come. How could I ask God's pardon for actions taken in service to His anointed King? How could I repent of sins that were simultaneously acts of obedience? In the end, I prayed only for strength to continue, for wisdom to navigate the contradictions of my position, and for the blessing of children who would justify the means by which they were conceived. Chapter 6. The Fruits of Necessity. Winter arrived early that year, covering Versailles in snow that transformed the geometric gardens into something almost mystical. The fountains froze into sculptures of ice, and courtiers wrapped themselves in furs and velvets as they hurried between heated chambers. It was during this season of crystalline beauty that I discovered I was carrying the king's child. The signs came gradually. A certain queasiness in the mornings, a tenderness in my breasts, a peculiar sensitivity to smells that had never bothered me before. Madame de Maintenon, who had become something between a confidant and a keeper, noticed before I acknowledged it myself. "You are pale these mornings," she observed, as my ladies prepared me for the day's activities. "Perhaps the court physician should examine you." Dr. Fagan was the king's personal physician, a man of 60 years whose discretion was as valued as his medical skill. He examined me in my private chambers with the detached professionalism of one who had attended royal births and royal secrets with equal care. "Congratulations, Your Highness," he said afterward, washing his hands in a silver basin. "You are approximately 2 months along. The child should arrive in late summer. 2 months. That meant the conception had occurred during one of my early visits to the pavilion, when I was still adjusting to the strange reality of my double life. Now that life had produced its intended fruit. "The king will be pleased," Madame de Maintenon said after Dr. Fagan departed, "as will all of France. The continuation of the Orléans line is a blessing for the realm." A blessing. The word seemed strange applied to a child conceived in calculated adultery, but I was learning that language bent itself to serve royal necessity. My bastard would be called legitimate, my adultery would be called devotion, and my shame would be called service. The announcement of my pregnancy was managed with the same precision that marked all court ceremonies. I appeared at Mass one Sunday morning, wearing a gown that subtly emphasized my changing figure, allowing the sharp-eyed ladies of the court to draw their own conclusions. By evening, whispers had spread through every salon and antechamber. The Princess of Orléans was with child, a miraculous blessing that proved her departed husband's love had borne fruit even beyond the grave. The king's public reaction was perfectly calibrated. He expressed delight at the news of his nephew's posthumous heir, offered prayers of gratitude for this sign of divine favor, and announced that the child would receive all the honors due to royal blood. Privately, he began planning for the education and establishment of his offspring. "The child will need careful handling," he told me during one of our pavilion meetings. My pregnancy had not ended our encounters, though they had become less frequent and more focused on planning than passion. If it is a son, he will need to be prepared for high office. If a daughter, for advantageous marriage. And if the child should somehow resemble you more than Philippe Auguste. Royal features run in families. No one will question a child who bears the stamp of Bourbon blood, regardless of which specific ancestor it might favor. As my pregnancy progressed, I found myself oddly comforted by the growing life within me. Here, at least, was something real and honest, untouched by the deceptions that surrounded its conception. The child moved and kicked with an energy that belonged to no one but itself, innocent of the political calculations that had brought it into being. My father visited regularly, ostensibly to check on my health, but actually to monitor the success of his investment. The House of Condé would benefit enormously from my child, receiving generous grants and favorable appointments as rewards for my service to the crown. "You look well," he said during one such visit, studying my rounded figure with satisfaction. "Motherhood suits you." "The child is active," I replied, placing my hand on my swelling belly. "It seems eager to enter the world." "May it be a son," he said fervently. "A son would secure everything we have worked for." but I found myself hoping for a daughter. A son would be thrust immediately into the brutal machinery of dynastic politics, groomed from birth for roles that would require the same sacrifices I had made. A daughter might have more choices, more opportunities to shape her own destiny, within the constraints of royal blood. Spring arrived with unusual warmth, and I spent many hours in the gardens, walking slowly along paths that no longer seemed strange despite their geometric precision. My pregnancy had given me a new status at court. I was no longer simply the peculiar widow who had married a departed prince, but the mother-to-be of royal heir, deserving of respect and careful attention. The child came in August, during a thunderstorm that shook the windows of Versailles and sent courtiers scurrying for shelter. I labored through the night with Dr. Fagin and a carefully selected team of midwives, women whose loyalty to the crown was beyond question. The pain was extraordinary, unlike anything I had imagined. Wave after wave of agony crashed over me as my body worked to expel the life it had nurtured for 9 months. But with the pain came a strange sense of purpose. This, at least, was mine to do, my burden to bear without assistance or substitution. Near dawn, as the storm finally began to subside, my child entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the birthing chamber. Dr. Fagin lifted the baby, examined it briefly, and then placed it in my arms with a smile. A son, Your Highness, strong and healthy. I looked down at the small face, red and wrinkled from its ordeal, and felt something shift in my chest. This was my child, regardless of the circumstances of its conception. My son, who would never know the complicated truth of his parentage, but would bear the consequences of my choices for the rest of his life. He has your eyes, one of the midwives said diplomatically, though the child's eyes were the cloudy blue of all newborns. And the Bourbon nose, added another, pointing to features that could belong to any royal ancestor depending on one's perspective. The king arrived within hours of the birth, officially coming to congratulate his nephew's widow on the arrival of his heir. He held the baby with practiced ease. This was not his first child, though it was his first son born to a woman, not his wife. Louis-Philippe, he said, naming the child after both himself and the departed prince, who would be acknowledged as its father. He will be Duke of Chartres, with all the honours pertaining to that title. Louis-Philippe de Bourbon-Orléans, Duke of Chartres. My son had acquired name, title and fortune before he had learned to focus his eyes. He would grow up believing himself the posthumous child of a prince killed in a hunting accident, never knowing that his true father was the most powerful man in Europe. As I held my baby in those first days after his birth, I tried to imagine the life ahead of him. He would be raised in luxury and educated by the finest tutors. He would learn languages and mathematics, philosophy and statecraft. He would dance at royal balls and hunt in royal forests, command regiments and negotiate treaties. But he would also live with the same constraints that had shaped my existence. The knowledge that his life belonged not to himself, but to France. That his choices would be determined by political necessity rather than personal desire. He would marry whom the king commanded, serve where the king directed, and sacrifice his individual will on the altar of dynastic duty. Was that a blessing or a curse? Looking at his sleeping face, so peaceful in its ignorance of the world's complexities, I found I could not say. Chapter 7. The price of secrets. The years that followed my son's birth settled into a rhythm of careful deception and managed truth. Louis-Philippe grew from infant to toddler to young boy under the loving but watchful eyes of carefully chosen servants. Officially, he was the posthumous son of Philippe Auguste de Bourbon-Orléans, heir to a noble line cut short by tragedy. Unofficially, he was the king's son, though this truth was known to fewer than a dozen people and spoken by none. My relationship with the king evolved during this period from political necessity to something approaching genuine affection. We met regularly in the pavilion. Our encounters now focused more on planning our son's future than on creating additional heirs. Louis XIV proved to be a devoted, if distant, father, taking keen interest in the boy's development while maintaining the fiction of being his great-uncle. "He has quick wits," the king observed during one of our private consultations. Louis-Philippe was then 4 years old, already showing signs of the intelligence that marked the Bourbon bloodline. We must ensure he receives the finest education. "I have been thinking about tutors," I replied. "Perhaps Monsieur de Fénelon for languages and literature, and Father Bossuet for theology." "Bossuet is too rigid. The boy will need flexibility of mind if he is to navigate the complexities of his position." The king paused, considering. "I will speak to Madame de Maintenon about recommendations. She has excellent judgment in such matters." Madame de Maintenon had indeed become a powerful influence at court, her relationship with the king deepening from advisor to something approaching partnership. She viewed my situation with a mixture of sympathy and calculation, understanding both the personal cost of my sacrifices and their political value. "You have done well," she told me during one of our regular meetings. "The boy is healthy, intelligent, and shows no sign of the irregularities that sometimes mark such arrangements." "What irregularities?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "Children born of divided loyalties sometimes struggle with questions of identity. They sense, without understanding why, that something in their heritage does not align with the official story. Louis-Philippe shows no such confusion. He accepts his place in the world without question." This was both reassuring and troubling. My son's contentment with his fictional parentage spoke well of our ability to maintain the deception, but it also meant he would never know the truth of his own origins. He would live his entire life believing a lie, making decisions based on false information about his own nature and destiny. When Louis-Philippe was 6, the king decided it was time to expand his social circle beyond the carefully controlled environment of the Orléans household. My son began attending court functions appropriate to his age and rank, playing with other noble children while being observed by dozens of sharp eyes looking for any sign of irregularity. I watched these interactions with the anxiety of a mother whose child's every gesture might reveal dangerous secrets. Did he hold himself too much like the king? Did his laugh echo his true father's? Did his way of tilting his head when listening betray his royal blood? But the other children accepted him without question as the Duke of Chartres, nephew to the king, son of the late Prince Philippe Auguste. They played at soldiers and courtiers, kings and queens, acting out the roles they would someday assume in earnest. My son took naturally to these games, showing an early aptitude for leadership that pleased his official family and worried me in equal measure. It was during this period that I received an unexpected visitor, Marie-Anne de Bourbon, the king's legitimized daughter by Louise de la Vallière. She was then 23, married to the Prince de Conti, and possessed of the sharp intelligence that characterized all the king's children. "I wanted to meet you properly," she said when we were alone in my receiving chamber. "We are, in a sense, family." The word hung in the air between us, loaded with implications neither of us could acknowledge directly. Marianne had been born a bastard, but legitimized by royal decree, raised as a princess despite her irregular origins. In some ways, her situation paralleled my son's, though the circumstances were different. "How kind of you to call," I replied carefully. "I remember my father's interest in your son's development," she continued, studying my face for any telltale reaction. "Such close attention from the king is unusual for a great nephew. His Majesty is generous with all his family." "Indeed, and your boy is fortunate to receive such generosity." Her smile was knowing but not unkind. "I hope he proves worthy of it." After she left, I sat for a long time in my chair, considering the implications of her visit. Marie-Anne had not stated her suspicions directly, but she had made it clear that she suspected them. How many others at court had drawn similar conclusions? How long could we maintain the fiction of Louis Philippe's parentage before someone spoke their doubts aloud? The answer came sooner than I expected, in the form of a scandal that had nothing to do with my son, but everything to do with the dangerous nature of court secrets. The Duchess de Montpensier, a woman known for her sharp tongue and sharper ambitions, had apparently discovered some irregularity in the official records of Louis Philippe's birth. Perhaps she had noticed discrepancies in the timing, or perhaps she had simply connected too many dots between the king's attention to my son and his apparent disinterest in his other great nephews. Whatever her source of information, she began dropping hints in conversations, making observations that were just short of accusations. "Such a fortunate child," she would say, "to receive such paternal attention from his sovereign." The emphasis on paternal was slight but unmistakable. Word of her comments reached Madame de Maintenon, who acted with characteristic decisiveness. The Duchess found herself suddenly unwelcome at court functions, her husband's military appointments reassigned, her financial interests subjected to intensive royal scrutiny. Within 6 months, she had withdrawn to her country estates, her reputation in ruins and her voice silenced. "Curiosity can be dangerous," Madame de Maintenon observed to me afterward, "particularly when it concerns matters of state importance." The message was clear. My secret was protected by royal power, but that protection came at a price. Anyone who threatened the official story would be crushed, their lives destroyed as completely as if they had committed treason against the crown. This incident forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth about my position. I was not simply a mother trying to protect her child's interests. I was a keeper of state secrets, and those secrets were defended with the same ruthlessness applied to military intelligence or diplomatic negotiations. My son's legitimacy was a matter of national security, and any threat to it would be eliminated without mercy. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Louis Philippe's future was secure as long as the current system remained in place. But that same system made me complicit in the destruction of anyone who challenged it. I had become not just the king's mistress, but his accomplice, bound to him not only by our son, but by shared guilt in the silencing of inconvenient truths. As Louis-Philippe grew older, I began to see more of his true father in him. The way he commanded attention when he entered a room, the ease with which he assumed others would follow his lead, the natural authority that marked those born to rule. All of these traits spoke of royal blood, though not necessarily the royal blood officially claimed. "He will make a fine leader someday," the king observed during one of our meetings. My son was then 8 years old, already showing promise in his studies and his interactions with other noble children. "What sort of leader?" I asked. "What future do you envision for him?" "That depends on many factors. The needs of France, the political situation in Europe, his own capabilities and inclinations." The king paused, considering. "But I suspect he will have opportunities for greatness if he proves worthy of them." Opportunities for greatness. The phrase could mean many things: military command, diplomatic missions, perhaps even marriage into foreign royalty. But it could also mean acknowledgement of his true parentage, official recognition as the king's son rather than his great-nephew. That possibility both thrilled and terrified me. Recognition would secure Louis-Philippe's future beyond any doubt, but it would also expose the deception we had maintained for nearly a decade. It would reveal my adultery, my son's bastard birth, and the elaborate fiction we had constructed to serve political necessity. For now, such recognition remained a distant possibility, dependent on circumstances none of us could predict. In the meantime, I continued my role as the devoted widow, the grieving princess who had miraculously produced an heir for her departed husband's house. But late at night, when the court slept and I sat alone in my chambers, I sometimes wondered what would happen when the truth could no longer be contained. Secrets, I had learned, were like water. They always found a way to seep through even the strongest barriers. The question was not whether my secret would eventually be revealed, but when and what the consequences would be for all of us when that day arrived.